Welcome to GynoCurious. I'm your host and creator, Dr. Amy Novatt. From both sides of the speculum, we're here to investigate what it means to be a healer and to be healed. Please send your comments, thoughts, concerns to comments@radiofreerhinecliffe.org. And to learn more about my clinical practice, please go to dramynovatt.com. I would be glad to have a 15-minute interview with you just to learn more about you, and you can learn about me if you would like. So in case you haven't noticed, October has been a time on GynoCurious to focus on two deeply connected themes: domestic violence and the upcoming local election here in Dutchess County, New York, for County Court Judge. I've talked about how important it is to vote, not just in the national elections, but at the local levels too. And that feels especially true now when so many of us are feeling kind of powerless to influence national policy and what's happening in the national stage. But here in Dutchess County, this November 4th, we have a chance to challenge the status quo and to make meaningful change right in our own backyard. Today on GynoCurious, we're talking politics, justice, and the ways local decisions can shape women's lives. Now, as you know, GynoCurious is not a political show per se, but as I've said before, women's health issues, women's health care has always been, in one way or another, a political issue. That's why I've had conversations in the past with folks like Senator Michelle Hinchey. And it's why I'm really, really glad to be speaking today with Kara Gerry, who is running for Dutchess County Court Judge this November. Kara is here to help us understand how this particular elected position, a county court judge, can actually have a real impact on the well-being of women and their families. Whether you live in Dutchess County and are voting in the local election, or you're tuning in from somewhere else, this is a conversation about how justice at the community level shapes our everyday lives. Kara started out as an assistant district attorney, then worked in private practice handling civil litigation, personal injury, and real estate cases. But feeling a strong pull to serve her community, she joined the Dutchess County Public Defender's Office as a night arraignment attorney. In 2014, she was appointed Senior Assistant Public Defender, and just a few years later, in 2018, she became Bureau Chief of the Criminal Unit, supervising a team of 6 attorneys while still managing her own caseload. Good afternoon, Kara. I am so grateful for you taking the time to be with us here in the studio today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Novatt. It's an honor to be here, and I'm excited to talk about the upcoming race.
Great. And please, Amy is just fine.
Okay.
All righty. So I guess, I like to start with all my guests asking just about their professional arc. Why law? Amidst all the other opportunities out there, why did you choose law?
Well, I didn't grow up my entire life thinking that I was going to become a lawyer. When I got to college, I picked a major and I picked history. And I loved history. And I was either going to become a professor of history or I was going to do something else. And I decided I wanted to go to law school. And I went to law school and I jumped right in. I loved it. I went to Pace Law School in White Plains. For the first year, the first year of law school is very intensive. And I lived on campus and I went to school, but I always worked my entire life. And I decided my second year of law school, I was going to take a job at a law firm. And I did that. I worked full time during the day and then transitioned to going to law school at night. And I worked with an attorney in White Plains, and he was a personal injury lawyer, very successful, very charismatic. And I decided at that point I wanted to be a trial lawyer. And he told me that, if I wanted to be a trial lawyer, I had to cut my teeth and be a prosecutor first. And that's the way you can gain practical trial experience. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did. I went down that path. I graduated from law school and I applied at different district attorney's office, and I landed a job at the Orange County DA's office. And I worked there for a little over 3 years and I learned a lot for sure. And after that, I was in private practice for a time being, but I always felt drawn back to practicing criminal law. And I decided I was going to do it on the other side now and be a defense attorney. And I did that in private practice. And then a job opportunity presented itself with the public defender's office in Poughkeepsie in Dutchess County. And I've been there ever since.
Great. Thank you. And it sounds like it's been the right choice for you.
Yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed my time there. I've handled thousands of criminal cases. It's hard work. It's exhausting at times, but it's also extremely rewarding when you can help people. And it's been invaluable. It's taught me so much empathy and perspective. Working as a public defender, you're working with people who are going through some of the most difficult periods in their life. They're accused of a crime, and I have to not only look at the case and determine what the evidence is against them, what the people can prove against them, how can I best resolve this favorably for the client. So I have to look at the legal aspect of the case, but I also have to get to know people on a human level and talk to them about how did they come to be involved in the criminal justice system. And so often people have incurred trauma from a very early age in their life, and they've developed mental illness, or they turn to substances to kind of treat emotional pain that they've been through. And it's been such an eye-opening experience for me because I've really gotten to know people on a human level. They're more than just a person or a number or a rap sheet and an accusation. They're real people who have a real problem. So as a public defender, as a defense attorney, you're part lawyer and you're part social worker in a lot of ways.
Yeah. It answers a question I was going to ask. You use the word nuance to describe how you interpret law or evaluate cases. And I think you just got to the heart of the matter. The nuance is the personality of the individual and understanding that they are just so much more than, as you said, a case number or the number on the docket. And, as a physician, I would say the same thing as a clinician, that I love doing surgery and doing procedures and kind of doing what all the other gynecologists do. But what my favorite part about my practice is getting to know the individual. And that's where the nuance lies. That's where the empathy lies. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So many folks listening to us are folks who watch TV, and there are judges on many TV shows. But if you had to describe how a Dutchess County Court Judge does her job, what is the job description? How is it different from perhaps other judges, or is it not?
So the Dutchess County Court judges, there are two of them, 10-year terms, and they handle all of the felonies that occur in the county. So all serious crimes. And what that means is you have what's called a criminal calendar basically every day where cases get called, and, there's maybe 25 cases or so on the docket, and you have an opportunity to conference the cases with both the prosecutor and the defense attorney to determine whether or not a plea bargain can be reached, or if the case is headed toward litigation, headed toward motion practice. And, you really have to obviously read the case file, read the indictment, read the bill of particulars, ensure that procedurally things are in order. You have to respond to motions. The district attorney will file motions. The defense attorney will file an answer. And as a judge, you have to, interpret the law and write a decision. And whether that means admitting evidence at trial or suppressing evidence and saying that it can't come in at trial. So you make really important decisions that obviously are going to affect the trajectory of the case and the trajectory of the outcome for the defendant that's appearing before you.
I guess I want to make sure that listeners know that I learned about you even before your campaign started. And I learned through interviewing and speaking with Nikki Addimando and her sister, Michelle Horton. Can you tell the listeners how you interfaced with these two ladies?
Sure.
Yeah.
So back in 2017, I was assigned to be the public defender in the town of Poughkeepsie court. And what that means is anybody that was arrested in the town of Poughkeepsie that was charged with a crime and couldn't afford an attorney, I was assigned to represent them. And, I'll never forget, it was September of 2017, normal work day. Dropped my son off to school. I came into work and a file was on my desk, and the charges were murder, the most serious charge that a client can be charged with. So I read the accusatory and I see it's a very young woman and she's accused with murdering her intimate partner. And, you know, it's always overwhelming, I'm sure for any attorney, but especially as a public defender, to have a charge of such a serious magnitude be assigned to you, because it's, you know, this is going to be a tremendous amount of work. So taking a look at the charges, I was immediately struck again by the age of the defendant, and I wanted to go meet with her at the jail immediately to get her side of the story, what happened. Before I could even get to the jail to visit with my client and speak to her regarding what happened, Michelle Horton and Elizabeth Clifton came into my office and they had binders filled with pieces of paper saying, Nikki has been seriously abused. She acted in self-defense. I can't believe she's charged. And it was overwhelming. I couldn't believe that within moments of getting into the office, these two women were in my office to talk to me, to let me know what happened. And I knew from the beginning that this was not going to be a normal kind of murder case, but I knew right from the beginning that this was going to be a very complicated and complex case.
Can you just remind the audience who Michelle and the other woman are?
So Michelle Horton is Nikki Addimando's sister, and Elizabeth Clifton is a very dear friend of Nikki, and one whom Nikki had confided in for years about all of the ongoing abuse that she was suffering at the hands of her intimate partner, Chris Grover.
Yeah. May I assume correctly that you learned a lot about domestic violence through that case?
It's crazy. As an attorney, you're required to take certain courses to keep up with your knowledge of the ever-changing law, continuing legal education courses. But so much of what you do as a lawyer, as a defense attorney anyway, is that you become an expert on certain areas in a case that don't have necessarily a lot to do with the law right off the bat. I remember when I was doing personal injury work, I had to become an expert in like ski slope safety and maintenance and trails. So in this case, yes, I had heard of battered women syndrome. I knew a little bit about it, but I had to do a deep dive and a lot of independent research to get up to speed on what exactly the battered women syndrome defense was, what it entailed, and what I now as the attorney was going to have to do to put forth a case to show that my client acted in self-defense and that she was in fact acting as a battered woman at the time she shot Chris Grover.
Did you find yourself shifting perspective about certain mythologies or prejudices that you had initially, but that got changed over the course of that learning process?
Yeah, I mean, before I even started doing a deep dive into battered women syndrome defense, I should tell you, I interviewed dozens and dozens of witnesses over the course of 3 or 4 months before I even started really getting into the nitty-gritty of how I was going to prove that my client acted in self-defense. And it was insane. I mean, I worked full days and then I would come home and speak on the phone with witness after witness after witness who called me and reached out to me out of the blue saying, I know you're representing Nikki Addimando. I want you to know on such and such a date, I saw her with bruises under her eyes or, you know, ligature marks on her neck or huge sunglasses on inside. And it was story after story after story corroborating that this woman had been tortured for years. So, you know, I did that. And then in speaking with Elizabeth Clifton, who had literally banker's boxes of Facebook messages between herself and Nikki, wherein they laid out a safety plan, an exit plan for Nikki, how Nikki was going to escape. And yeah, like anyone else who didn't have experience in battered women syndrome defense, I thought to myself, why didn't she leave? She had so many opportunities. She had so many chances to leave. And I think that's one of the biggest misperceptions of trauma and what it does to people and the psychological impact it has on people who are being abused survivors. Yeah, I mean, it was a fact-finding mission as well as like a deep dive into the law to see how I was going to be able to put forth an adequate defense for this woman. And it was a lot. I mean, one of the hardest parts too of it was I had to earn Nikki's trust. And it wasn't like I went to the jail and would sit there for 2 hours and she would pour out everything that happened. At some times she was very forthcoming. At other times it was like pulling teeth. And I had to go to the jail for hours upon hours, weeks upon weeks to gain her trust so that I could get the whole picture. One of the difficult things that I also encountered while interviewing Nikki was that she didn't give me like a chronological or linear timeline of when the abuse started and when it stopped. And what I learned in doing research on my own is that people who have suffered trauma, the way their brain categorizes memories is not linear. It's not chronological. It's snapshots in time. So to try to piece together what happened, it was a monumental undertaking.
I bet. And then just to be able to kind of hold on to the stories that she shared with you that were often so violent and so awful is also hard. I mean, I know how hard it was for me to hear it. I know how hard it is for me to hear it in the office when women finally share these stories with me. So I applaud you for the tenacity and courage and willingness to take on those stories. There's, not just from a legal point of view, and that was your job, but as a human being, holding on to those stories, hearing those stories can be so, so challenging. So listeners are probably wondering, okay, so why is Amy talking to Kara? So let's go a little bit further. You're running for an elected position, and this position is against a gentleman who has sat on the court bench for 10 years, Ned McLaughlin. And why are we talking about Ned today, and how does it interface with Nikki, and then subsequently your decision to go against him in this vote in November?
So I was assigned the case in September of 2017, and I was Nikki's attorney from September until Memorial Day of 2018. So 8 or 9 months I was her lawyer. And I had devoted hundreds upon hundreds of hours, invested hundreds of hours into this case, interviewing witnesses, establishing a relationship with a very traumatized person. And after 8 months, as things were heating up and the DA was now under the gun, so to speak, to present the case to the grand jury to get an indictment, the prosecutor made an application to the court to have me removed from the case, saying there was a purported conflict of interest. And this conflict of interest was that the Dutchess County Public Defender's Office had represented a vital witness to the prosecution's case almost 10 years prior on a DWI. Now, I never spoke to this individual. I didn't have any secrets or confidences that would have developed over the course of an attorney-client relationship with this individual. I wasn't even in the office.
I was going to say, were you even there?
No, I wasn't even in the office when our office represented him. So she made that application. The prosecutor made that application to the court, and the court ultimately granted the prosecutor's motion and removed me from the case.
And who made that decision?
Judge McLaughlin made that decision.
Okay.
And, it was so tricky because it gave the prosecution a 9-month head start on this case. And again, as I said, this was such a complex case with so many witnesses. You could have F. Lee Bailey as the defense attorney. They were still going to be at a disadvantage to catch up for the amount of time that had been lost.
Was there ever an acknowledgement from the appellate court later on that dismissal of you was inappropriate?
It was a point of their appeal. It was a point in Nikki's appeal. And the New York City Bar Association wrote an amicus brief strongly challenging my removal from the case. And the appellate division ultimately said, I think, that the court has broad discretion to, remove an attorney for a conflict of interest. But the interesting part is this vital witness that the prosecution was going to call in their case in chief at the trial was never called, and his name was never mentioned again.
Oh, that's hard. That's really hard.
It was hard.
So the goal for today's conversation, Kara, was for those listening who are going to vote in the local election and those who are elsewhere who are going to vote in their local elections for a district, county, judge seat. I want them to know how their decision to vote for one person versus another impacts individuals like Nikki, other domestic violence victims, women and their families in general. So can we go a little further on how your opponent impacted Nikki's life and why, if perhaps you were sitting in that position, a different decision, a different outcome might have been served?
I can't answer that.
That's fair. Okay. So what we do know is that Ned McLaughlin, well, I guess correct me if I'm wrong, contributed to the fact that Nikki served a lot of time in jail.
Well, the judge is the gatekeeper as to what evidence is permitted to come in at trial. And there was a lot of evidence that was suppressed pre-trial that the jury didn't hear about.
Did McLaughlin suppress it?
Correct.
Okay.
And some of that evidence was that about 3 or 4 months prior to the incident where Nikki shot Chris, she had gone to her midwife and described an assault made by Chris against her where he raped her with a gun, with a handgun. And the jury never heard that. Now, there's rules of evidence that only statements made to a doctor for treatment and diagnosis are permissible at trial, are able to be admitted at trial. Otherwise, it constitutes hearsay. But in this case, the statement that Chris raped her with a gun, in my opinion, was being offered to the doctor for purpose of treatment and diagnosis. I mean, this was such a vicious attack that, the midwife wrote in her report that the injury was so gruesome, she couldn't even collect a sample. And I just think that was a huge piece of evidence that had the jury heard that happened, I think it would have influenced their decision. Another piece of evidence that was excluded was Chris posted all sorts of horrible rapes and assaults on Pornhub. And the jury was able to see the pictures, but they were never able to see the user information on who posted those videos. And the name of the person who held the account who posted the videos was Grover Respect. And again, these videos documented just brutal torture. And the jury never heard that information because Judge McLaughlin determined that there wasn't enough evidence to show that Chris Grover was the owner of that account. So the judge serves as the gatekeeper as to what evidence comes in. And that evidence will, the jury obviously makes their decisions in any sort of trial based on what evidence they see. So McLaughlin was privy to this stuff, but the jury never saw it.
Thank you. That helps. That helps. I might be off. So again, correct me if I'm wrong. There's a lot of conversation right now about body and medical autonomy. And just to clarify for the listeners, body autonomy is the broader concept of the right to make decisions about one's own body, while medical autonomy is a specific application of this right within the context of healthcare, focusing on the right to make informed choices about medical treatments. So as vulva havers, we are aware that the national GOP agenda is certainly to try, and it has been successful in eradicating both body and medical autonomy, particularly for women. Will you have an impact on local politics or policies that, impact body and medical autonomy? I'm curious.
The very nature of a judge is that you're an impartial arbiter of the facts that come before you. So you're not supposed to have any preconceived determinations of how you're going to rule, because you have to wait until you hear all the evidence that's before you. I talk a lot about, the differences between myself and my opponent, and my opponent was only ever a prosecutor. I was a prosecutor and a defense attorney. As a prosecutor, your focus is on public safety and accountability. And as a defense attorney, your focus is on due process and individual rights. And it's an adversarial system. So the prosecutor presents their case from the viewpoint that I mentioned, and the defense attorney presents the case from the opposite viewpoint. And the judge is the one who has to balance those competing interests at times. And I think that having done the job on both sides is one of the strongest advantages that I have. And just having done the job from the defense side gives me a tremendous amount of perspective. And I think it would help me to be an impartial judge. So there's a lot of restrictions on judicial speech and everything, but no, I can't. I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree with what you're saying. But as a judge, I don't know that I would have any impact on policy. Judges are not policy makers.
Right. I guess I want the voters to know how, if they elect you for this position, how might you impact their community? Because that's what they want to know. Not just how they want to know how they might be impacted if they're an individual in the court system, but just as a community member. Do you? Will you? Can you?
So a county court judge makes very serious determinations regarding people's sentences that are going to impact not only the course of their lives, but the course of victims' lives, the course of families' lives that are peripherally involved.
Nikki's being a great example of this.
Yeah, for sure. Part of sentencing, it's outlined in the criminal procedure law, what factors you're supposed to consider and balance as a judge when imposing sentence. And yes, at times you have to be punitive. If you have someone who's committed an atrocious, violent crime, you sentence them to prison as a judge. As an assistant district attorney, I definitely recommended prison in cases where it was appropriate. But prison can sometimes be just a Band-Aid fix. We need to, as a society as a whole, but a judge has particular power in really addressing root causes of criminal behavior. And for those people that are convicted of nonviolent offenses or who have nonviolent offenses pending before the court, we have to be open to considering alternatives to incarceration, diversionary programs, treatment court. New York State is now implementing mental health treatment courts across the state, veterans treatment court. And the judge is the gatekeeper as to who is permitted into these programs. And I think it's something that it's a resource that we really need to take advantage of, because prison can become a revolving door. If we can help people address the root causes of why they became involved in the criminal justice system, which so often stem from trauma, addiction, and mental illness and domestic violence. So we need judges who are willing to take a chance on people and try to give them treatment, which in turn will make the community safer in the long term.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to get a little granular about certain words that are tossed around, not only in campaign speeches, but just in the world of law. And the first is justice. And I guess I'd ask, how would you define justice?
I think that having done the job as a defense attorney, it's not just about the truth coming out. I mean, I think justice is much broader than that. It's about treating people with dignity and respect and treating people fairly, regardless of what their socioeconomic background is, the color of their skin, their gender, their upbringing. As a public defender, I've worked in the city of Poughkeepsie Court predominantly for most of my tenure there. And I've worked very closely with some of the most marginalized members of the community. And just having that experience has really shaped what my view of justice is. And I think that it's one of the differences between my opponent and myself.
Kara, I'm voting for you on November 4th. And I'm doing it for a lot of reasons. But I want us to make sure that those who are listening understand how you and McLaughlin are different. And what I'm hearing and what I know about you is that, and what you're speaking about, and pardon me, I'm opinionated, but we're talking about compassion. We're talking about the capacity to take a look at the person in front of you, the accused, and the victim. And again, trying to understand not just, and bear with me, I may be wrong, it's not just about the law, but it's about the environs in which they come, which you've mentioned, and understanding what brought them to the courtroom, because that's not the same for everyone, right?
It's so important.
Yeah.
What you say. I mean, I've had a piece of paper on a bulletin board at my office for 20 years, and I've had the same piece of paper. It's a crumpled, wrinkled up thing at this point, but I've had it on my wall in my office since 2006. And it's a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "An injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere." And I've looked at that as a prosecutor, and I've looked at it as a defense attorney, and I'm going to look at it as a judge. And I promise that I'm going to work hard to do the right thing. And the right thing means that, the law is not black and white. Otherwise, we wouldn't have judges. The law is open to interpretation. And I think the things that you mentioned, mitigating factors, need to be considered and taken into account when you're developing a sentence or deciding on what sort of sentence to impose on someone. It's so important. And everyone comes to things with their own biases and perceptions of things. And again, just my background, I think, is so much more diverse than my opponents.
Yeah. I mean, my tagline is from both sides of the speculum, because I've been a patient and a clinician. And what I have learned from both perspectives so enriches what I can share with patients. You don't have to, rob a bank to understand why someone might rob a bank, right? Or I don't have to have cancer to understand what a cancer patient might be going through. At the same time, I can tell you, having an anatomy that resembles everyone I see or most people I see, that helps me. So again, being able to look at both perspectives from the law, from the jobs that you've had, feels so important. And in this situation against McLaughlin, a really important feature of your campaign that I want people to know about. Absolutely.
In working with so many clients that are accused of crimes, whether they're minor crimes to very serious ones, it's easy to look at things quickly and make a determination as to, how you think a case should resolve. But one of the most difficult yet rewarding parts of my time as a defense attorney has been getting to know people on an individual level. And again, what their family life was, how they arrived at where they did. And it's so true what they say, every person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. And I've witnessed that firsthand. People make mistakes. They do things that they regret. And not that people shouldn't be punished or have to take accountability for it, but you have to be able to understand and see that. And I have the perspective to do that, having done the job as a defense attorney.
Isn't there that saying, the punishment has to befit the crime? I would imagine that's where nuance is. That's where a judge can help in interpreting sentencing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, there was a study done a few years ago, I think by NYU, and Judge McLaughlin is one of the top judges in New York State for imposing excessive sentences.
Do we know how many of those are reversed by appellate courts?
I don't know the exact figure, but, cases get sent back or the appellate division just reduces the sentence on its face. I mean, Nikki's case is one of the best examples. You know, Judge McLaughlin sentenced her to 19 years to life in state prison, and he failed to apply the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. And that sentence was reduced to 7.5 years.
Yeah. In a lot of industries, there's conversation about institutional knowledge. So here, McLaughlin has served 10 years, and oh, he must know a lot. And here's Kara, who is a newbie to the idea of being a judge. How can we tell people about the value of your, well, in effect, a new lens, a new perspective, the value of your career?
I would say that my experience is broader. I've prosecuted cases as a district attorney. I met with law enforcement individuals. I worked with victims as a prosecutor. As a defense attorney, I've handled trials on that side. I've looked at cases where evidence was obtained illegally, and I've had to file motions to suppress, and I've had to prepare defendants to potentially testify, and I've had to cross-examine law enforcement officers. So I think the breadth of experience is important and pertinent. And I'm a lifelong resident of Dutchess County. I have 3 kids. I'm raising them in this community. I've been a public servant my entire life, and I have a vested interest in the safety of our community for the long term. And I think the balanced perspective that I have makes me the best candidate for the job.
Great. So those who listen to GynoCurious are not confused about my bias vis-a-vis being a feminist, being an avid supporter of women's right to healthcare and well-being. Is it fair to say that gender comes into play in the courtroom? And does it come into play potentially as a judge?
That's a big question. I mean, of course it does. When I started at the district attorney's office in 2006, I started with a class of 8 attorneys, and I was the only woman in the group. And there was a dress code in place there. Women had to wear skirts or dresses or skirt suits. And I think back on it, and that was less than 20 years ago. And it's just crazy to me. My experience as an attorney, as a woman, I mean, it shapes my perspective. As a mom,
Right.
I have 3 kids. They're all coming to me saying who hit who first. I have to try to assess everyone's credibility and who am I going to believe and who am I going to punish and who am I going to hold accountable. So I think both my professional experience as well as my, just being a mom, I think, we need more women on the bench, I think.
Right. That's right. Yeah, you can't disentangle them. You just can't. And so there was a reason I asked, because I think that, I bring a female perspective to my work, for better or for worse. It just is. And for people who I see who value that I can, in fact, empathize with their body parts or gender identity, it is what it is in a way. I certainly know about your work for Nikki, and the way that Nikki herself speaks about you is with such fondness and trust. And that was, as you pointed out, that didn't come the first day you met her. That was work. That was a capacity for empathy and compassion and interest, true interest in who this person was. And Nikki is only one of many, many, many women who are victims to domestic violence. We talk about it being, 1 in 4. So there are so many women listening to this program today who are victims, and who I certainly hope never, ever, ever have to be in a courtroom, and who are able to safely leave. Although we know, again, it's the leaving that often escalates the violence. But I think that it's really important that people think really hard about this candidate and this election, and that Kara is a candidate for Dutchess County Court Judge that will bring nuance and humanity to the job, and that's important. It's so easy to think of the justice system as something distant or abstract, but as you've reminded us, the people we elect in these positions make decisions that ripple through our communities, decisions that can impact safety, opportunity, fairness, and dignity. So again, those of you who are living in Dutchess County, I really, really encourage you to learn more about the candidates. So Kara, how do people learn about you? How do they get all those details?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I mean, I have a social media and an Instagram page. It's Kara for County Court. And my website is also Kara for County Court. So you can read a little bit more about me. You can follow me on the campaign trail. And, what I can say to listeners is I've been a devoted public servant my entire life. I've worked hard in every job that I've ever had. And I'm committed to our community and the safety of our community for the long haul. And I promise that I will bring that to the job. And I promise I will review each case carefully and bring the perspective of not only a prosecutor and a defense attorney, but a mom and a woman. And all that together, I think really will have an impact, a beneficial impact on the community.
Kara, thank you so very much for joining me today. I'm so grateful that you're running. I applaud the tenacity to run a campaign is no easy feat, and be a mom and a partner, et cetera, et cetera. So I wish you a moment of rest once you are elected. And we would look forward to having you on GynoCurious again as a judge. I also want to thank Jen Hammoud and Maddie Rosenberg, my co-producers, and David Hoffman, my editor. I always want to thank the Epicurean for having us here in their space. And as always, if this conversation resonated with you, please share the episode, follow the show, keep these conversations going with your friends, your family, and your community. I'm Dr. Amy Novatt. Please stay curious, stay connected, and take good care.